Now, we've been having, for those of you who are visiting, which is most of you, a very powerful time the last few weeks here at Kingdom Faith, and I want to share some elements of truth with you today which will help that same power to be released in your life. I think every Christian probably says, I need more power in my life. And actually, as we will see, God has already given us all the power that we need. It's just we need to know how to harness that power, how to lay hold of that power, use that power, and see that power impacting and affecting the practical circumstances of our lives. So let's turn first of all to John chapter 1. Because we're going to begin by talking about grace. I'm going to give you some key words today. And the first of these words is grace. I want to put these key words together for you, so that you can see how these different things are to work in harmony with one another in our lives. Now, grace is not your favorite elder sister. Grace is what God gives. Grace is giving. But it's giving what we don't deserve. If you deserve something, you earn it. If you win something, it's a reward. But if you get given it, although you've done nothing to deserve it, or ever could do anything to deserve it, that's grace. And our God is a God of grace. He has always been a God of grace. Even in the Old Testament, it says that He is gracious, slow to anger, rich in love. But when the Father sent Jesus into the world, with the ministry of Jesus and what has happened after that ministry in the history of the church, but with the coming of Jesus into the world, a new era or age of grace began. In other words, the way in which people were able to experience the grace of God changed with the coming of Jesus. Now, John speaks about this. He talks in the opening chapter of his gospel about Jesus being the Word through whom God brought all creation into being. He spoke and it was made. Now that Word became flesh. Jesus left the divine glory that he had in heaven, and he accepted the weakness and the limitations of humanity. But when he did that, this new age of grace and of truth dawned. And John puts it in this way. In verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. In other words, he came full of giving to those who didn't deserve anything, and he came full of truth. And then he says in verse 16, from the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. In other words, this grace that came through Jesus Christ was expressed in what he gave. What is blessing? Well, blessing is receiving what makes you happy, fulfilled, contented. When you bless the Lord, you make him happy. That's why we are to live to bless the Lord. Bless to make him happy, meaning to fulfill what he wants in our lives, to fulfill his will. That makes him happy. That blesses him. We any believers here? Okay. So Jesus came full of grace and truth, and from the fullness of that grace. Now, if you think for a moment, Jesus being full of grace, if something is full, there's no room for anything else. I mean, there could be nothing in Jesus that was the opposite of grace. What would be the opposite of grace? Judgment? Condemnation? But he said, I haven't come to judge, I've come to save. I've come to give, I've come to bless, I've come to give grace. And John, you see, slips in this little bit of testimony because John, of course, lived with Jesus throughout his ministry here on earth. He was one of the first disciples to be called, and he outlived all the others, actually. And he says, from the fullness of this grace that came with Jesus, we receive blessing upon blessing upon blessing upon blessing upon blessing upon blessing upon blessing. Now, the important thing for us to realize this morning is that's God's purpose for us, for every believer. Now, at first, that sounds a little bit selfish to say, well, God's purpose in my life is that he blesses me more and more and more and more. But God is not a fool. And he understands that the more we are blessed, the more we can bless others. That if we're not very blessed, we won't be much of a blessing to others. But the more we're blessed, the more we can bless others. People are always thanking me for the way they've been blessed through my ministry. Well, that's nothing to do with me. It's simply that God has blessed me so much that others get blessed. So it's all the work of his grace. Therefore, all the glory goes to him. I'm just a channel of his grace. And that's what he wants you to be, a channel of his grace. So from the fullness of his grace, you receive blessing upon blessing upon blessing, so that then you can be a channel of blessing, a channel of grace to others. Somebody thought hallelujah and forgot to say it. It would have been a good place to say hallelujah. Okay, so he then says in verse 17, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So the time of trying to please God by simply obeying religious laws was over. There's still people that try to please God like that. Isn't it sad? Whereas the way you please God is to receive as much blessing from his grace as possible, so that you can be as great a blessing as possible. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so there's the word grace. This is the essence of grace. If you turn to the epistle to Romans for a moment, chapter 5. We've got to add to this word grace another word.